All right, welcome everybody. Feel free to add any topics to the agenda. Starting off, I added this one about MD5 optimizations for E-tag calculations. There have been discussions about this and some work in the past. It was just recently raised again in a PR discussion that I've linked in the agenda. I also opened a tracker issue to track this. The earlier pull request tried to offload the MD5 stuff to background threads, and so was a little too expensive in the thread synchronization. But other projects are using SIMD and vectorization for this instead, and have shown speed ups of up to like 5x, which sounds really useful. I did do a search on GitHub and found a C++ library that has a AVX2 implementation that we might try to experiment with. But yeah, hoping that somebody is interested in taking a look at this, because I think that it could give us some good wins, be beneficial in reducing our CPU usage.
I mean, yeah, it seems like the AVX2 project that would be native would be the right approach. So that does it not?
I actually don't have much experience with that instruction set. I don't know how common it is. Is that in AVX 512? Is that
it's widely available, AVX2. Let me see what how far it goes back. But yeah, until as well as AMD introduced it, but it's not new. Yeah, I meant in terms of like the Golang runtime. I don't think we're going to integrate that.
Right. Yeah.
No, it should be the same thing.
So is anybody interested in giving this a try? Essentially, it would just be plugging in that library and doing some performance measurements.
If nobody here is, we should tag Mark. He might be willing to look at it and can certainly measure it.
I think this would be something cool to learn about, but yeah, Mark's kind of the performance expert. And even if I did help out, I think I'd want his input, at least a lot of his guidance.
Okay, yeah, I'll send an email and CC him, but we'll just track this feature in the tracker linked in the agenda. Since we've discussed it in the past, I just wanted to raise the issue again. Sounds like that we could do something and get a lot of benefit with not too much work. Any other thoughts on this before we move on? Next up is from Ali.
So I started to take a look at the multiple zipper backends or multiple zipper filters work. I know you had sent an email about this last August, Casey, and I read that in detail and I had a few questions. The reason I'm bringing it up now is in the D4N and D3N caching work, it looks like we're going to want to be able to use multiple filters, or at least have that ability in the code base. The questions I had were, I guess, so I understand that the email you sent out outlined multiple backends. How is that the same or different from using multiple filters with just one backend to start with?
So I mean, you would just need to use the nesting in JSON. Very sorry, got to answer the door. Be right back.
Yeah, I guess you just nest one filter after the other is what my guess would be.
Does JSON not have anything like a list?
No, it does.
So my thought would be what we want is a list from, a list that represents the stack, right? From top to
Mhm.
bottom or bottom to top, doesn't matter. I guess top to bottom would be better.
Hmm.
And then within that, if there's branches, then we nest other lists.
Okay. But when you
That
say top to bottom, cannot like, is the top always filters and then the bottom always backends?
I mean the first entry in the list comes immediately after ops. The
Okay.
second entry in the list comes after the first entry in the list.
Uh-huh.
Third entry in the list comes after the second, and so on. And the last entry in the list would have to always be a store.
Okay.
Right. So I'm just imagining this as one JSON dictionary essentially, where each would essentially be a filter, but the leaves of the tree would be the backends. And each filter would have its own JSON format for describing what the next layer or layers were. And as we
Interesting.
process it, we would essentially just use factory functions for each type of filter, and they would parse that JSON, and then if they need to instantiate other backends or other stores, they would call into the factories for those, kind of in a nested recursive fashion.
Okay. Yeah, that works.
So, somewhat similarly, I guess there's no difference between a store and a filter here in terms of what's nested. It's just that everything's going to be in an object called stores, or do we change it to backends? I forgot if this was before or after we changed
Drivers.
store to backend when those drivers, that's what it is. So the key to the nested JSON, or the key for the large nested JSON object, would be drivers, and then it would start with filters and then go down and have
No,
stores as the lowest.
You would
backend.
have, if I'm understanding correctly, and Casey corrects me if I'm wrong, because I would like to understand this, you would have a JSON object that would describe something, a driver, and you would call the factory function on that JSON object, right? If that JSON object is just Rado store, it's done. If that JSON object is a filter, then it would then contain within it a nested JSON object that describes another driver, right?
Yeah.
And that filter would then call the factory function on that nested JSON object. And it could conceivably have a list of JSON objects that it called on each of them, but that would be specific to that driver. That driver's factory function would have to be able to understand the JSON with the list, right? So if you tried to use a filter that only could have one, one thing below it, and you tried to pass it a list, it would fail to parse the JSON and cause an error.
Hmm.
And ultimately, eventually, at the leaf of every one of these, so the last non-nested JSON would be a store in every case.
Got it. Or that makes sense to me.
And if it's not, if the last one is a driver, then its factory function would fail because it needs to have a next pointer.
Right.
Okay.
And so this way, this protects us from, trying to pass branching config into something that can't handle branching config, and protects us from dangling filters and protects us from trying to have a store be a filter. Because in each of those cases, its factory function only knows how to parse the stuff that's valid for it. And if it tries to parse it and it's not valid for it, it'll just fail, causing the config to fail out, and presumably RGW to fail to start.
How would this work for the ceph.com file? Or would you just have to pass in JSON instead?
So all of the existing, all of the existing config for filters and stores would be replaced by a single config entry that points to the JSON.
Oh, it would point to the JSON file. Okay, got it.
I think
So
that
the
go ahead.
proposal of this email was to store the JSON stuff in the RGW zone object in Rados instead of in ceph.conf.
That only works if you have Rados.
Right. We
Yeah,
don't want it to be
that was my
Rados
next
per se.
point. Sorry, that was my next
Sorry.
point. RGW.
When I say in Rados, I wrote the config store abstraction for Sal,
Okay.
and there's a Rados implementation and a JSON implementation and a DB store one. So if we had other kinds of backends that we want to store this configuration in, then we would extend that interface.
Okay, so then the JSON store would still need a config entry pointing to the file, but the other ones would get it out of wherever their other configured locations are.
Like Active Directory.
Right,
That's
like
right.
Active Directory.
So the whole point was that,
Or could we just use MDNS and get it for
Right.
free without any config?
Maybe
Zero
so.
conf.
Yeah, well, like, yeah, rendezvous. Maybe it's not at all. Maybe it's reasonable.
but yeah, the idea was that all Rados GW instances in the same zone would read the same configuration from the zone, and so we wouldn't have different stacks trying to serve the same data.
Right.
So then I need to go through and look at the code because we wouldn't be storing this data in RGW zone params since that's, at least as of now, Rados store specific, or it's defined in Rados store, and you need to understand how config store works a little better.
Config store does expose RGW zone params. So you would just add it as a field to that.
Okay. But I need to go through and understand that relationship better. And then the last question, the last two questions I had were, number one, I see in the email there's in your prototype for load store, you're doing a DL open and then a DL SYM for a shared object library. Was that assuming the zipper loadable modules would work? So that's not currently how we initialize.
Yes,
Okay.
that assumes loadable modules, but in the meantime, you could just call the factory function for the store directly.
Okay. I just wanted to make sure that I understood.
Dare I even ask, what is up with libzipper loadable modules?
You can ask. Before I left on PTO, I had successful builds on Focal that did not get the undefined refs that I'd been getting previously. F36 builds on F36 were always successful, or after a certain point were always successful. So I just need to rebase and run some local tests and update the PR.
My goodness.
And possibly figure out, why the loadable module can't be found when I run outside of vstart.
Okay, that's good progress.
But
Yeah.
at least before, running under vstart, it could find and load the loadable module, and it was running the RGW tests successfully. on my local machine.
The last question I had around this is, how can I make some incremental progress or work towards getting this started? And would just working on, I guess, having those factory functions defined, switching out the config, and then making it so that we can load 2 filters and 1 backend that way, or I guess 1 filter, 1 backend, or even 1 backend.
I would start with 1 backend and then 1 filter and 1 backend, and then move from there.
Okay.
We do have the base filter, which is strictly pass through. So when you want to do a bigger stack, I mean, you can always stack up like, 2 or more of those if you need to.
Yeah.
Because they're no ops. So that would be useful for testing. So I would start with, Rado store, and then maybe DB store, and then base filter.
Okay.
Right. For each type of driver, you're going to have to define the JSON format. So I would start with the Rados store and make a factory function for that knows how to parse the JSON that we need for the Rados store. And then you can pick a type of filter and create a format for that. And where it needs a next backend, you could plug in the existing Rados stuff and expect that to work.
Okay, that makes sense. And is there any other JSON config for Rados store that we would expect besides just the word Rados, or just the string Rados for now?
I don't think so.
Okay.
Eventually, maybe path to ceph.conf, but I don't know.
Yeah. Okay, that makes sense. No, I'm just focused on getting something out to review and that works in the next couple weeks. That's it for me. I hope that this got everyone's juices around the topic flowing again.
Any other thoughts here? All right, next is from Corey, following up on the OLH fixes. PR is linked in the agenda. What's new, Corey?
Yeah, I updated the PR maybe an hour or 2 ago and covered one more case that I found where things could go slightly wrong. So I think there's basically the PR is fixing like 3 different cases at this point for ways that things can go wrong, as well as adding a couple of Rados Gateway admin commands to clean things up in the cases where they do. And what it mostly boils down to is their concurrency issues with clients submitting requests for the same key almost at the same time, and the timing issues create some race conditions and stuff that a lot of times ends up leaving behind index entries, sometimes also instance objects that never get cleaned up in the future. And we found that in production for us that it's like a big problem. I mean, we've cleaned up billions of these entries and millions of these leftover objects over the past couple of weeks, and they've affected a lot of customers, and they've affected things in multiple ways, including performance issues that result from having a lot of extra index entries and iterating over them, and also just complete failure of lifecycle processing due to those, because there's a limit to the number of these entries that the OLA or the OSD CLS method will iterate over before it returns an error that ends up being unhandled. So long story short, I mean, I think that the PR is covering pretty much all the cases that we know about that were causing issues for us at this point. And there is a slight difference in some of the older releases. So I had initially on the tracker indicated that there was a commit on main and reef that had fixed the issue. And I updated the tracker this morning as well. But I was slightly wrong on what I originally thought was going on. It turned out that the reason that it was fixed on main and on reef was that there was a different commit that was changing the way resharding worked such that it didn't change the instance ID of the bucket. And that was actually the reason that it wasn't, the put 404 specifically part of it wasn't a problem on main and reef. Some of the other issues are still an issue on main and reef that are in the main PR. So there will be a separate commit for Pacific to fix that part of the issue. And some of this
about that one specifically, we had already been tracking set OLH returning -2 when resharding. I attached that as a related issue to number 61359.
Okay. Yeah, I'm going to go ahead and open a PR for the Pacific and Quincy fix for that. Then I have had that for a little while. We've kind of been playing with it in some of our environments. So I think that's good. And then we've also been using the Rados Gateway admin components of this PR for a couple weeks in production as well. And that has been going really well to clean things up. So I guess at this point, I guess I'm looking for feedback. Casey, I'm wondering where you stand on the PR. And then also after that, I'd like to talk a little bit more about just how we can do a better job of testing these kinds of scenarios for the future where it's related to concurrency issues or errors that are thrown, non-happy path kind of scenarios.
Yep, I've still been working on review. I'm focusing on your Rados GW admin commands. Initial feedback is that I think coroutines would be a better fit than the threading stuff, but the actual repair stuff looks okay. It's not exactly clear to me whether the -- fix thing is necessary, if there's a reason to run it without fix before running it with fix. But I'm happy to follow up on this stuff on the PR.
Yeah, that sounds good. It's probably the best place to discuss details. So yeah, I guess as I was alluding to, the more general, I think, conversation is like, I think there are 3 or 4 separate scenarios here where things can where there can be race conditions between different threads or different Rados Gateway admin instances when requests are made for the same key. And we've had a couple in the past as well. And I guess I'm still concerned there may be more cases because it's pretty hard to reason about what's possible with all the different steps within those transactions for these version buckets. And I'm just curious if you guys have had conversations before or ideas around how to do more kind of chaos monkey type testing or better concurrency testing. I think in one of my tests, I have like a specific dev level config option to inject errors, or I have a couple of those actually in this PR. But that's pretty unwieldy for thoroughly testing this kind of thing, since there are so many different places that you might want to inject delays or errors in order to tell whether something is happening. And then also, once you fix the issue, of course, the new implementation, often the test becomes irrelevant in a sense, when you're trying to inject specific errors or delays and stuff.
Yeah. So I mean, most of our test coverage is coming from S3 tests, which doesn't have visibility of, the X adders or leftover index entries. And so I'm glad that you're adding some test coverage outside of S3 tests that specifically looks for those things. I think that's a good strategy. I agree that it's not great adding a bunch of config variables to inject errors, but I can't really think of a better way to do that. So I think what you've done there is okay. But I don't think that we've put much thought into this as a team in the past. This versioning stuff is indeed complicated, and very few of us understand it, especially not in full.
Yeah, my initial thought, without having put much time into it from a high level, is potentially having an alternate version of the objector or something that can do some like random latency injection on different calls or error injections or something, or just randomly while we're running S3 tests, maybe just to kind of exercise some different cases there where things can happen that aren't quite right, but that we actually see quite a bit in production apparently. But maybe I'll look into that more, and we can talk about that on a future call if I can come up with some proposals of more specific things that we might do to gain some more coverage that's covering some of those chaotic cases for the future.
Yeah, that would be great. The way I see it is that you've essentially just discovered ways that our consistency model was broken, and have good fixes for those. But I think at a higher level, it would be really valuable if we could document exactly what our model is for versioning. And I would be happy to work with you on trying to create some documentation that describes the different steps and how the OLH head object correspond with the bucket index transactions to keep things consistent.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. I am planning on doing that too, and I'm glad you offered to help. I will definitely reach out to you, or at least ask you to probably review a draft of it. But I do have a lot of notes and a lot of stuff put together because it took me a long time to go through and figure out how everything worked together, and I don't want to lose that on my own end either, but I can see where that would be helpful to share with everyone, to kind of give a human level understanding of what the whole process is without having to step through all the code.
Yeah, that would be great. For Dex, I think the place to start would just be a very high level outline, and then we can fill in the details kind of incrementally. So you don't need to put a ton of work into it up front.
Okay, sounds good.
So any other ideas for test coverage, how to make sure that we're not breaking things in the future?
Well, I think we need to. I mean, we said we raised this in some internal meetings at the beginning of the year. I I think we need saturation and workload testing. They're not easy asks. Silence.
Yeah. It would be good to combine that with a step at the end, maybe that scans for orphaned instance objects or index entries. I think
I mean,
Eric
Mark's
has
workload
done.
testing reaches the point where you can see stuff like this. If we could get it into upstream,
Okay.
that's one thing. That's a help. That's a help.
Right. Well, I mean, we have machines in the lab where we can run things, but I still don't think that like trying to run it automatically as part of Toothology is going to give us much benefit. But if we have maybe
Well, that may be. I mean, we need
automation
some way to guarantee we actually do it. But anyway, I'm not saying anything novel there.
Yeah, some kind of automation to set things up and start running them would be great. And then just we could build a process around releases or some way to make sure that we're running this stuff regularly and actually looking at it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that would probably go a long way. I mean, my other thought is just handcraft some like really abusive clients, the sort that you end up seeing in real production and deploys, and yeah, do some sanity checks after running some of those kinds of things just to make sure that there's not like leftover index entries and stuff like that, which we can use some of these new Rados Gateway admin commands for to check for pretty easily at this point. But I think some of these things would have been fairly easy to expose if you just had a client that was doing a bunch of things and a bunch of concurrency kind of things.
Well, basically, I mean, as long as they're not doing illegal things, you know, then workload tests that hit saturation will do it.
Sorry, Matt, you're really quiet all of a sudden.
It's weird. Check.
Same issue.
You lost your microphone or something?
Is that better?
Yes.
Much better, thanks.
Okay. I just moved my microphone. I'm sorry. No. I mean, Corey, do you think it relies on clients performing illegal operations or illegal operation sequences, or I mean, because otherwise, good tests that get a lot of activation, can mostly do what's needed. I mean, maybe you might inject latency and things like that, but we shouldn't. But I'm sort of interested in what your experience is. You seem to be saying that there's bad client behavior that induces bugs.
Well, I mostly mean like just we have particular clients that just submit a lot of requests and a lot of like concurrent requests. Like they might do a few deletes for the same key, like within a few milliseconds of each other or something. And that has exposed issues or just really frequent updates to a particular key. Has caused some stuff apparently. But yeah,
Those are things. Okay, those are things that we could be pulled into HSBench or fold into Warp maybe. Maybe something those. It'd be nice to have a standard kit that we believe is solid and can issue fast.
Mm-hmm.
And
I'm not familiar with Warp. I guess. Do you have a link to that? I could probably find it.
Sorry, I'm ashamed to say it comes from MinIO. We've been using it more internally because it has some good capabilities that overlapped with the thing we had to retire, the COS bench. It can run. It has some real issues too, but they're probably fixable. But it's Golang based, and it can do a lot of parallel issue, and it can gang up a bunch of clients, automating them from different and potentially in different hosts, and consolidate the results. It has sort of built-in canned workloads that that are statistically arranged.
Yeah, so that seems like that would be perfect for that kind of use case. And then yeah, like we said, I think the only other thing might be to induce some random latencies or something, because sometimes that helps trigger some of the issues, and we definitely have seen that.
Yeah, our downstream QE does for multi-site testing started injecting latency with TC. So that and for the things we've tested it with, it worked well.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, and Corey, you made a good point. I had mentioned Eric's work to scan for orphans, but these tools that you're writing would look for these very specific issues. And I guess that is a case where it would be useful to run it without fix, just to flag that there are issues.
Yeah, and I would say we've been using it without fix intermittently too, because we have customer support tickets or whatever saying their bucket listing is slow, and knowing that can be a side effect of these particular issues. That's just been our initial check, are they affected by this same issue kind of thing. So I think there is value in that from the user standpoint as well, just to identify whether that's a problem that somebody is experiencing.
All right, and going back to the Pacific Quincy issue where the bucket instance ID changes, you were going to raise a separate PR with that fix, is that right?
Yeah, I'll have to do a separate one for that because it's not relevant for Maine. So I guess I'll target it. You want me to target the initial one at Quincy and then backport that to Pacific?
Yeah, that sounds perfect.
Okay.
All right, and I will follow up on review hopefully today, but certainly this week. Any other thoughts on this? All right, moving on. Last up from Krunal, revisiting notification retries.
Hey, hi. We discussed this a couple of weeks ago about the notification there are multiple options on improving the notifications. If you open the tracker, there are a bunch of options that we wanted to try in terms of defining retry time and then converting from using existing Rados object to a FIFO object. Since we haven't got any solid consensus on the retries or the time limit, but at least in terms of converting using FIFO, the way I'm saying is, can we start working on the first part of converting from Rados object to FIFO thing, because that does not, that's kind of clear cut requirement there. We have had use cases where we have seen this issues where the Rados object is getting full if the broker is down. So we kind of keen on working on that part at least, because that kind of unblocks us from using this particular feature.
So I think an important part of the design was having a way to push back against clients if we can't keep queuing up all of the notifications. I do think that the existing CLS queue limitation is too small. So I do think it makes sense to go to CLS FIFO, but I think we could also use some way to limit how big the FIFO can grow.
Definitely, yeah, that makes sense. But basically, currently, it's just like within few minutes of our workload, we see the object getting full, the CLS queue, the queue getting full, basically.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, I think we've learned that that the reasons that we needed FIFO, and I think we want to apply it more places. I think we have reason to believe that it's got to be faster. Too, it said that you should be able to get parallel and queue to queue, maybe not get it from CLSQ.
So, and any ideas how to enforce a limit on the size? That I think that gets tricky because FIFO is distributed over several objects, so we don't really have a single place to manage that.
Yeah. I mean, it's yeah, it's kind of tricky. It's not something top of your head, like, or you just would consider this.
I mean, is there intended to be a strict bound? I mean, it's a good feature, but yeah, like we don't want to get it at the cost of significant bottleneck and turning a large bottleneck into CLS FIFO.
I'm hoping if we get a consensus of the other two as well, probably the size would become irrelevant, because if we have some way of defining number of retries or the time that it needs to stay there before it gets trimmed or probably gets removed out of the queue, then probably enforcing that strictness on the FIFO size becomes irrelevant. Like if we decide to go the other two.
So I'm just remembering the design process for persistent notifications specifically, but I thought that it was a requirement that they be reliable. So I don't think that a max retry or time limit is what we want there. And the other requirement was that there was some pushback to clients preventing the queue from growing without bound.
So this is, I mean, this, of course, I mean, we can still be configurable where by default we can say there are no retries, but then we could have a default configuration variable while creating a topic which would decide number of retries. Like, of course, there could be a scenario where it's completely down and it just stays there forever. So wouldn't it make sense to just go and trim them, delete them or something? I mean, today, if you look at the AWS documentation, it also says, it's not kind of clearly mentioned, but it says that they do the best efforts on trying to send the notification, but it doesn't kind of say it's guaranteed it will be delivered no matter what.
Right.
If we are trying to be compliant with this, of course, AWS notifications here.
I do think it makes sense to have options like that, but I do think that we wanted to provide a version that was reliable.
Is it worth having? I mean, it would be nice if you all were here to discuss more what our options are.
Sure. I mean, yeah, we've opened a tracker. UL himself has opened that tracker and probably wanted to get some traction on this, some views from people, but seems like nobody has yet. We haven't received any solid inputs there.
Yeah, I guess in the case where the broker is just down indefinitely, I would also like to avoid all of the overhead of writing and trimming all of the entries in the first place. But
I mean, yeah, today while creating topic, there is no way we kind of verify whether the broker is online or something. So create topic does not verify that. It's only while sending the notification is when the connection is established. So, I mean, you're kind of coming to a point where there could be a scenario where client is writing, but their broker is down. We need to verify that. mean, we could discuss all those, but at least converting from the queue to FIFO at least seems logical. If we come to have a hard code size that we need for that FIFO object, we can at least start work on that. Does make sense?
I do think so. Yeah. The existing implementation is kind of broken up into two steps. There's a
Reserve thing.
reserve step,
Right. Yep.
yeah, and then the commit at the end.
Correct. Yep.
Maybe FIFO, if it starts out not enforcing a limit, would just be a no op on the reserve.
Correct. If there is no limit, hardcore limit, yeah, makes sense.
Yeah, at least as a first step, and we might brainstorm how to implement that part later on.
Cool. I mean, so can we? I mean, we'll take up this tracker and try to work on at least the first part of converting from queue to FIFO, and then we can, during this journey, we can decide if we want to, how we want to enforce the size release.
Yeah, okay.
Thank you.
Adam, you did a ton of work on FIFO. Can you think of any easy way to track something like the total size? I think we do have a head object somewhere, but
The total
we probably
size in
don't want to.
bytes. I mean, we could. I mean, we could do something like that. We'd basically just have to do another rendezvous and update the head object every time we did.
I don't think we want to have to enforce that in general.
I wonder if so there's already a kind of transaction on that each time that we add a new tail object. I wonder if that could be a good place to enforce like a limit on the total number of objects.
We could certainly enforce a limit on the total number of tail objects if we wanted to.
I think that ought to manage the problem at some level.
All right. So yeah, I would just ask you to update the tracker issue to make sure that Yuval is aware of what you're starting on.
Sure. I'll try to update the tracker, yeah, and yeah, assign it to us, assign it to me, and then start work on the first part at least.
Sounds great.
Thank you.
All right. Anything else?
Another thing about the testing for the data sync fairness. Probably this is for Shilpa. Actually, based on the last comment, it says there are some issues going on still. Is it good enough to take the current version and do the scale testing? There were a few crashes before. I see they've been fixed, but there still seems there are some issues. But is it good to go for a scale testing is what I was asking, so that we can just take this up as well?
I think it's a promise not to get mad or cry, but if so, I think it's probably, from what I'm talking to Shilpa, probably not too far.
Yeah, hi. Yeah, there are a couple of issues when we go over a few generations and then we perform data sync in it. So I'm still trying to iron out some cases like that, and also some corner cases that might still be lurking. But I think we should start doing some scale testing there, and some early feedback would help.
Okay, so we'll take up to whatever the current state of the PR is patched and build the RPMs and try to get the test done and get back to you.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you.
All right. Any last minute topics for the agenda? Okay, let's call it here. Thanks, everybody. See you next time.